Hello and welcome to PressCast. I'm Farbs, and in this episode, I'm joined by Sam Husseini, Jordanian-Palestinian independent journalist out of New York. He's also an author, he's a scholar, he's a political activist, and he's basically a treasure trove of information about the region, the Middle East. So join me as I talk to him about the region, about Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and much more. Hello, Mr. Husseini. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. So let's start with you yourself. How's life?
Good, busy. I have a full-time job with the Institute for Public Accuracy, but I've been spending a lot of time doing investigative reporting about the origins of the pandemic in recent months, over a year actually. I live in.
Would you care to share some of that findings with us?
Sure. Well, it started for me when there was a CDC news conference in February of 2020 about the pandemic, and I asked if it was a complete coincidence that there was a lab. Now we know several labs in Wuhan, China, and they basically dismissed it. And then it was widely regarded as a conspiracy theory in the U.S. press. I'm not sure how it's been covered exactly in Iran and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And it made me look more closely at effective U.S. biowarfare apparatus. People might recall the anthrax attacks, which followed the 9/11 attacks, and were depicted as coming from evil Arabs or Muslims. They had letters. I don't know how old you are. I don't know if this is in your cognitive memory.
Well, I'm 37.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So after the 9/11 attacks, there were a series of letters sent through the U.S. Postal Service to members of Congress and members of the media that said, praise to Allah, death to America, death to Israel, obviously pretending to come from Arabs or Muslims. They ended up coming from a U.S. or U.S. allied lab. And obviously, they never actually got to the bottom of it. So that was one of several strains that have some connections to continued U.S. effective biowarfare efforts. Now, I don't know where the pandemic originated. I don't know for certain that it didn't come from nature. But I think that there was a concerted propaganda effort to dismiss the possibility that it could have some kind of lab origin. And lab origin doesn't necessarily mean the labs in Wuhan. They could be being framed as we saw in the anthrax attacks. That was a classic, what you would call a false flag operation. So I've attempted to pursue this very systematically, I've done serious media work, including on weapons of mass destruction over the years. I did a lot of the in-depth work regarding the lies about Iraqi WMDs before the invasion in 2002. Actually, before it's about the 1990s that there was a concerted effort of in the U.S. of fabricating evidence, so-called evidence about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction. But this has been a particular breakdown because, virtually every sector of the media structure in the United States is attached to political movements or parties. So you have MSNBC, which is the Democratic Party line, and Fox, which is largely the Republican Party line, and the media structure just simply pursues what each of those entities want. There's very little media space for actually pursuing facts and so on. And this honestly even includes the left in the United States, which I've been associated with, because you talk about a lab origin in Wuhan, they immediately, say, oh, well, that's going to polarize things with China, which is what the U.S. militarists want, and therefore we can't think such thoughts. And I'm about trying to find out what the truth is, and not necessarily calculating what the.
I'm sorry to jump in, but one of the things that have proven, at least to me, during this pandemic is that there's a lot of misinformation about the origins, about everything, about the cures. There is so much disinformation. So how, as a scholar, how do you cycle through this, this ocean of information? How do you know which one is accurate, which one is solid, which was not?
Well, it's difficult. What I've I've scaled back my ambitions from. I mean, other independent actors may be able to determine the origin of the pandemic, but if we can't, then we can at least expose the sources of the fabrication of the information in the process of trying to do so. So, for example, you had Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance. He funded the lab in Wuhan. I exposed that he also got far more money than there was publicized money that he got from the NIH. I found out that he got far more money from the Pentagon and USAID, which is the State Department, which is sort of a soft power CIA. Eventually, those facts got out there, and he's been substantially discredited as a result of that. So I think that pursuing things like that does have some tangible consequences.
I'm just curious. This coronavirus, this one is just a new strain. This is not the first time that we as humans have been hit by this virus. So, like, we had SARS, and we may have had other variants in the past. So, why do you think this one might have a lab origin and not the SARS? Why didn't we talk about SARS coming out of a lab back then?
I believe, I haven't investigated this in full, but it's my understanding that the initial outbreak of SARS, they found an intermediate host, which is what they've been looking for this whole time. They said it's a pangolin, it's a this, it's a that, and it always ended up being a dead end. So with the initial SARS outbreak, they did apparently find an intermediate host. And I emphasize the initial one because since the initial SARS, there were, I believe, 3 lab leaks of SARS after, after that. So there's a substantial body of lab leaks from all countries that are engaging in dangerous lab work. The United States has led the way in effectively undermining international conventions to prohibit the use of dangerous lab work, but other countries have followed, including China and Russia. Obviously, the UK and France. Israel hasn't even signed the relevant treaty. We have, pertaining to your point that there's no good source of information, I think we're in a state of global crisis, fundamentally. There are no trustworthy institutions, whether that's in the media sector, whether that's in the global governance sector, international law, political sector, and so on. Anybody very, the people that you have with integrity don't generally have resources. We have to try to find ways of getting around that. And then when you do have some strains of possibility of that happening, those things are immediately attacked. So, for example, when WikiLeaks disclosed the Iraq war logs, what was the first thing that the US government did? It attempted to pull the plug on WikiLeaks getting funding by going to the credit card companies so that ordinary people who might actually want to support a global media institution exposing these facts and affecting the discussion on the world stage would be starved of resources. And then, of course, they prosecuted Assange, for the disclosures regarding U.S. war crimes in Iraq and demonized him to the U.S. liberals regarding. So any time an institution attempts to assert itself on the global stage, that they are immediately ruptured. So I think that those are some of the issues we're dealing with, and why I say we're in a state of global crisis, effectively.
I know that you know a lot about Iraq, but could I ask you the next question about Afghanistan? Okay, but just because today I read about Bolton saying that U.S. withdrawing from Afghanistan, they're walking away doesn't mean that they lost. They're just they're out of patience. And then I was just cruising through Twitter, and I saw many reactions of Americans saying that, well, sir, walking away means defeat. So how do you see this? I mean, it's been 20 years, and now Taliban is gaining more power again, and U.S. is leaving a vacuum. What's happening?
Well, I'm very critical of Bolton, and I think he's a systematic liar. But there are occasions when he might be telling some version of something that's true. The U.S., first of all, isn't ending the Afghanistan war. They are withdrawing troops. Now, I'm not sure exactly what that means in terms of contractors and in terms of quote unquote special forces. But I am quite certain that they are going to continue effectively an air war. That is assassinations by drone and perhaps other means, and will effectively, continue a war of sorts, a dirty air war, as they have in other places. I don't think that, it's always very hard to figure out what the stated goals, what the actual goals are, and whether they're the actual stated goals. So, even in the case of Syria, for example, at times the United States indicated that regime change was the goal. I was never certain that that was the actual goal. Putting a state like Syria, or for that matter, Libya, in a state of chaos is an accomplishment by the Machiavellian standards of the U.S. empire. If you can keep Syria weak and hobbled, then that's good for you. And it sort of shows the evolution of U.S. policy. That is, in 2006, Israel attempted to attack Hezbollah directly and basically lost. And the U.S. attempted to pressure Iran in numerous ways, and largely unsuccessful, although it inflicted a fair amount of damage, of course. And so they ended up going after the weakest link in what they perceive as a chain there, and did a great deal of damage to Syria. It allowed Saudi Arabia to, the entire structure of the Arab uprisings effectively pummeled into chaos the largest secular states and allowed the corrupt Gulf monarchies to further assert their power in the region. And it was also to the delight of Israel that Syria would be weakened. So, so sometimes success by the standards of the United States government is a very gruesome thing, and it doesn't mean that everybody, has to bow down before them. You know what I mean? They can't have everybody be a proxy, but they want potential those who they disfavor to be either in a state of chaos or a state of weakness, attempting simply to fend for themselves. So, for example, when you had Venezuela asserting itself, globally to some extent, with a very charismatic figure, Hugo Chavez, um, and potentially causing a great deal of problems to the United States, it was with a great deal of delight that Venezuela encountered all of these economic problems. And I think what I've been thinking about a great deal lately is, and this is, I'm sure, relevant to your situation in Iran, which I don't know a great deal about, but I'd love to learn more. For example, now we have with Cuba, right? I mean, to what extent a third world, a developing country, can assert an independent path and have democratic structures, right? Because Cuba has provides healthcare for it has succeeded in materially providing for its people with minimal resources. There's no objective reason why Cuba should be better able to provide for its people than any number of Caribbean countries or Central American countries, which do nothing of the sort. Uh, Compared to Haiti, for example. I mean, my God. But so, and I'm sure that Cuba, like Iran, has some level of authoritarian structures. The questions to me is to what level those are legitimate authoritarian structures. And I don't mean legitimate in that I accept them philosophically, but as a practical matter, to what extent can if Cuba were to totally open itself up and dispense with any sense of any kind of authoritarian structure, the US would decapitate it in no time flat. Cuba has only survived, I think it's fairly evident, for 60 years, despite massive onslaughts by the United States, including, I should say, biological weapons. It's an issue that I'm investigating more and more now. The U.S. has substantial evidence that the U.S. has deployed biological weapons against Cuba, but for very good reason, because you have plausible deniability, right? The one good thing about war or nuclear war or any kind of war is that you know that it happened. With biological weapons, that's not the case. You don't know that it happened. So this has been something that I've been, focusing on in terms of what are the legitimate, to what extent you can have legitimate, quote unquote, authoritarian structures if you want to have an independent path. If you just simply want to grovel and do whatever the hell the United States wants, then you don't need that. So in the case of Iraq, we had a very hard shell. We had a very oppressive state, and the U.S. wanted to crush it, and the only way in the end to do that was an outright invasion.
Well, there was this article that I read. I just want to know your opinion on that, which argued that the United States is no longer interested in the Middle East as it was before. So it's not going to spend as much time as it was spending in the region, and it want to focus more of its energy now to China. How much of this argument do you find logical?
They've been trying to do that for a while. I mean, under the Obama-Biden administration, the term was the Asian pivot. And I think that, it's substantially fueled by the rise of China as an economic power. And I think that we'll see some of it. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. But it's hard to tell exactly what the relationship in general with China is going to be, because on the one hand, U.S. planners definitely see it as a great rival, but they have all kinds of accommodations. I mean, China now has more billionaires than any other country except the United States itself. So I don't know how serious, China, as opposed to, say, Cuba's commitment to economic equality is. And you have a highly authoritarian state there. I mean, what I don't want to see is, I neither want to see war nor excessive collusion, right? I don't want to see the United States becoming even more authoritarian, developing things from China, and China borrowing things from the United States to become more economically unequal, right? I mean, every country has good aspects. United States, you do have a good amount of personal freedom. The system encourages you to misuse that personal freedom for things that are either frivolous or stupid or whatever. But it does have that. And I think that other countries could learn from that. But I think that the United States has all kinds of horrific aspects of its society, and it needs to listen to others. So the interplay between China and the United States is going to be very important. But I don't think that one should just simply say, oh, U.S. planners are targeting China, therefore we have to take China's side. I think that is that's a feeble approach.
Okay. Mr. Husseini, you're also an author, correct me if I'm wrong, and you have written on Arabs-Israeli relations. Am I right?
I have. I've never. Author is a funny word. I've never written. I've never taken the time to write a book, but I've written numerous articles, and people can see my writing, or a good deal of it, at Husseini.org. And I have over the years written a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
So where are we at this stage of time? What's happening?
Well, there's obviously a lot to say, and I'm sure you've addressed it in other ways. One aspect of it that I focused on is Israel's nuclear capacity, and I helped place a article by Desmond Tutu, which was published in The Guardian on New Year's Eve, in which he called for Biden to finally acknowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal, which no U.S. president has done. Indeed, the last several presidents have written, apparently, according to the New Yorker, secret letters to Israel saying that we will not disclose your nuclear weapons arsenal. And of course, Desmond Tutu, coming from South Africa, the U.S., Israel cooperated with the apartheid regime of South Africa in terms of potentially giving them nuclear weapons. And had that happened, it might have forestalled the possibility of the end of the South African apartheid regime. Indeed, Tutu, and I'm sure your listeners are familiar with Desmond Tutu as the Archbishop of South Africa and the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, which ensured the peaceful transition away from apartheid. Posits in this piece that Israel's resilience, in that it effectively has an apartheid state, that has outlived South Africa's is in part due to the fact that it does have nuclear weapons. Um, Israel's nukes are not simply pointed at Damascus and Cairo and Tehran and so on, but they're also pointed at Moscow and effectively at Washington, D.C. Israel could bring down the entire world if it so wanted to. And this has been a long-standing hypothesis called the Samson option. And I have to say, every year at the UN, you have these diplomatic statements, including from the Iranian officials, about Israel's nuclear. I think they really have to look at how Netanyahu speaks to the UN in very direct and clear terms.
Drawings, maps.
Yeah, well, why not go up with a map that shows Dimona and shows the number of nuclear weapons that Israel has? I don't understand, given the viciousness of the assault and that Israel has done through conventional weapons, and given the extreme threat that its nuclear weapons pose, that the statements of officials who are ostensibly critical of Israel, including Iranians and others, are not clearer. I'm kind of surprised by that to some extent.
So this is happening while Iran and the United States are trying to re-engage the nuclear deal. And I think after 6 or 7 rounds of talks in Vienna, nothing happened. The Iranian side wants all the sanctions lifted all once, and the Americans apparently say no. So where do you see this end up under Biden?
Well, I'm not sure exactly where it'll end up. I mean, clearly Biden is also doing other things. He's bombing allegedly Iranian allied forces in Syria and Iraq. And there's this, brinksmanship of some sort, I guess you would politely call it, going on between the two parties. I view the U.S. system as being highly functional. That is, Trump and his withdrawal from the deal. It gives the establishment a level of plausible deniability. It used to be that you wanted to give the president plausible deniability. Now presidents are used to give the system plausible deniability. So Trump can withdraw from the Iran deal, can withdraw from the Paris Accord. Biden, who's a horrific establishment figure, can come in and pretend to look reasonable to many people who want to believe that. So it's, some people look at the US system and view it as chaos and deranged. I look at it as brilliant and Machiavellian and very, very, very functional. It keeps the US public divided based on personalities, so that Goldman Sachs and the military-industrial complex always win. You always know who's going to win at the end of the election, at the beginning of it. They could well re-enter into an agreement. I haven't studied the particularities of it, but I remember doing so a couple of years ago. And I mean, in many ways, the Iranian nuclear deal, as I understand it, is kind of ridiculous. Since, I mean, Iran is a party of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that, things should be done comprehensively. And I don't see why you need necessarily a separate deal. It's just simply because the U.S. has these economic sanctions in place that attempt to single out Iran in this respect. Meanwhile, again, of course, Israel hasn't signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. and indeed is, as I said, threatening the planet with nuclear destruction, as everybody is silent about it. And I think that that's highly depraved. I should say, including current U.S. members of Congress, that piece that Desmond Tutu wrote asked Biden to acknowledge Israel's nuclear weapons. No sitting member of Congress, as far as I can tell, including so-called progressives like Ilhan Omar and so on and so forth, have acknowledged that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal. Actually, that's not totally true. Schumer kind of, and I questioned Schumer about this several years ago. I occasionally question people in Washington, D.C. to the extent that I can. And Schumer kind of grudgingly, after I did a follow-up in which he looked utterly ridiculous, saying, I think they, you don't know that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal. And he kind of waffled on it. And that's part of what I've tried to do in being in Washington. It's obviously been very difficult with the pandemic, but I'd occasionally, I'd go to the Sunday morning talk shows and ask politicians questions as they walked out. I never chase anybody or anything like that, but they have their interview with ABC, and then they come out, and then CNN will send a camera crew and ask them the same banal question that they just got asked by ABC. So I would go there with a cameraman in tow who I'd pay $50 or $100 to, and ask them actual tough questions. And one of my go-to questions is, do you acknowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal? And
what do you get as answer?
Well, the funniest one was Pence. I questioned Pence before he was Trump's vice president. He was on the committee. I think he might have been the chair of the committee, a foreign relations subcommittee on the Middle East. So I asked him, and I can send you the clip if you want to play it, but he basically
of course,
he takes a minute, do you acknowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal? And he looks down and he's, processing, he's never been asked this question, obviously. He's processing that he can't say yes and he can't look ridiculous and say no. So he's processing. So he's like, I acknowledge that Israel is our most trusted ally. and we will continue to take actions to defend our homeland as they take actions to defend ours. And then I followed up and I said, do you think that it increases or decreases U.S. credibility around the world when U.S. government officials can't even acknowledge that Israel has a nuclear weapons arsenal? And, again, there's a brief pause. And he's like, I acknowledge that Israel is our most trusted ally. It's just utterly hilarious. So
okay, please make sure to send me the clip. I can play it somewhere around here, maybe.
You've also served on the Foreign Affairs Committee. Do you know that Israel has nuclear weapons?
I am aware that Israel is our most cherished ally, and I strongly support Israel's right of self-defense and to take such actions as are necessary to secure their homeland as much as we take actions to secure ours.
Do you think that it increases or decreases U.S. credibility around the world when U.S. government officials can't even acknowledge that Israel has a massive nuclear arsenal?
The American people support Israel. I call Israel our most cherished ally, and I will continue to stand without apology for a strong U.S.-Israel relationship and strong cooperation with our most cherished ally in a very volatile part of the world.
Mr. Husseini, it was great to have you. I mean, we're running out of time, and I love to listen to you, and I love to have you more times on the show.
Delighted being on with you. I think it's hilarious how we both have our art behind us here.
Yeah. I mean, I just put it here because I didn't want you to see how messed up my room is. I'm just hiding his stuff. Okay. I just want to ask you to end the show for us. I mean, say your ending words, whatever you want to share with us.
Goodness. I mean, what I think, it's been excellent talking to you, and I think that a good deal of what needs to happen is more and more global dialogue. I don't think that obviously we have objective limitations in terms of language, and we're doing this in English, and I'm not even sure if it's for an English audience or an Iranian audience or whatever. Um, um, so I think that's a key thing, and however modest the movements are, there have to be movements to, in their embryonic state, to develop the global structures because they don't exist. It's become blindingly obvious. Part of my background is computer science, and I saw both the potential and the threat of the internet and of what people called social media, but what is actually big tech. And now it should be blindingly obvious to everybody that these are managed systems that act in collusion with governments, especially the U.S. government, um, in order to, um, present information in a skewed format. So the threats to humanity. I wish I could quote Rumi or something at this point. The threats to humanity are everywhere, and institutions, self-interested institutions, are attempting to, in effect, restrict the human spirit, and we have to find all manner that we possibly can to overcome that.